Hello, everybody, and welcome to the panel discussion about identity and privacy. I've got three terrific panelists here with me today, and we're going to talk. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a few different things to give some context, and then we're going to kind of home in on identity and privacy, so that the identity and privacy discussion kind of makes sense in the light of what's going on. So that's kind of the way we've set it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to very quickly introduce themselves in case there are people in the audience who can't read. And then once you know who everybody is and you have their perspective, then we'll start our conversation. So let's go clockwise. Clockwise to me. So let's start top right. Megan, would you like to tell people who you are and why you're here?
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Megan Heinze. I work for a company called IDEMIA. A lot of people don't know IDEMIA. We're found in 180 countries. We're #1 in civil identity and #1 in police biometrics. We're probably in your pocket right now. So if you have a driver's license, we have 80% of the driver's licenses in the United States. If you have a credit or debit EMV card, we're probably in your pocket as well because we have over a third of the market. Or if you have a smartphone, we're the SIM card probably in your phone right now. So we do a lot today in both digital ID and also in physical identity.
Thanks very much, Megan. So basically you take identity pretty seriously. It's a business.
Yes, it is a business.
Thank you. Adam, would you like to explain TrustStamp?
I'm Adam. I'm with Equifax, though.
Oh, sorry. I've got you mixed up. I'm trying to go clockwise in my written notes go the other way around. Right. So let's stick with my clockwise plan. Andrew, would you like to explain TrustStamp for us, please?
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Gowasack. So I'm the president and one of the two co-founders of TrustStamp. We are an Atlanta-based company. Actually, we're graduates of both the Atlanta Tech Village and an ATDC company. So hello to everyone from the Atlanta community. So TrustStamp is predominantly focused on identity, but in particular, the elements of privacy and security of identity data. I think everyone, especially the panelists here, are familiar with the amount of personal records that have been exposed over the last several years, and that number seems to keep trending in the wrong direction.
It's all of them, basically, isn't it? It's all of them.
Exactly. And so as we start looking at new ways to establish identity and re-authenticate individuals, TrustStamp has created some proprietary methods for not only protecting that data from breaches, but also enhancing privacy for individuals. And so really excited to be a part of the discussion today, David.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Appreciate it. Adam, do you want to remind us what you guys do?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Adam Gunther. I lead digital identity globally for Equifax, Atlanta-based company represented in the South. What I'm focused on in particular is really looking at the intersection of people's identities, consent and permissioned use, and data. And we see we have a huge role to play in helping people transact digitally, prove who they are, gain access to services, and do that in a secure way that's trusted.
Thank you very much. So before we get into kind of some of the more sort of detailed, nuanced stuff about identity, I want to ask you guys just how you feel about the big picture, because it's kind of the elephant in the room at the moment. We can't not talk about it. So we're all from home. We're not having fun in Atlanta because we're all connecting in from, I was just about to say dialing in from home, which would be embarrassing in front of all the teenagers in the audience, but we're connecting in from home because of the virus. And in a couple of discussions I've been in recently, people have said, and I think there's some validity to it, that the virus is actually, although none of us would have wished it this way, but I mean, the virus is actually accelerating the trend towards digital identity. Is that your sense of what's going on, or is that just what people in the industry think? What do you guys think's going on?
Absolutely. It has accelerated innovation across the board, and especially on the digital front. As we all know, during the pandemic, of course, we couldn't go to a store, so everything became digital. People bought everything online. Globally, this is happening as well, and digital ID has become a forefront across the world. So traditionally, you look at countries like Estonia, for example, who traditionally have an EID. They've had it for a long time. Now everybody is pushing forward with that because they need a way to authenticate who you really are and verify who you are. Today in the United States, we mostly rely on the physical world. And now that the physical world has to move to the digital world, that transition is happening. So IDEMIA, for example, has been working on mobile driver's licenses in a few states. It's been taking a while, I'll admit, but now more states are on board and saying, let's move forward.
Right. So would you say, so basically people were thinking about, in fact, mobile driving license is a good example because the ISO standards for that are all in place now. So it's somewhere where there's likely to be some action. So, but I mean, people were thinking about that anyway, weren't they? The virus has given them a nudge, but they were already thinking about it.
Well, we've been thinking about, I think about it in 1999. I thought by now we would do everything virtual. So when the internet was big, I thought, okay, I did online banking. I was excited. I went to this bank that was called wingspanbank.com. Everything was going to be internet. And I thought by now we wouldn't have a physical branch at all. But guess what? Things take time. The same with online shopping. Think about it. We've had online shopping forever. Look at Amazon. It was small. It was just books. It kept on continuing to grow. And now everybody is leveraging everything online. People who used to say, hey, I'm not going to buy groceries online are doing it now. So if you guys remember back then in 1999, some of us did buy groceries. And then all those like Peapod and others went out of business. Now look at everybody's doing it again. So, you know, there had to be, unfortunately, a pandemic forced us quicker to move forward. So in some countries, they already pushed forward. Here in the United States, we were a little slow because we already had infrastructure in place.
Yeah, Megan, if I can actually...
You say how long things take change. That's a really good point, because I was in a discussion earlier on today in a completely different thing about Amazon using biometric payments in their stores. Nobody remembers. Piggly Wiggly had fingerprint payments like 20 years ago. You could pay with your finger in. It takes a really long time for these things to take off. Andrew, what is the problem that not having digital identity is? I mean, you know, we're talking in general terms here, but like specifically, why has not having a digital identity infrastructure proved to be a problem in these very difficult times?
Yeah, so I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of financial institutions as of late, and that ranges from, you know, very small community banks and credit unions to the very, very large. And really, it's a twofold problem. One is something Megan's already touched on, which is if you're going to enroll new customers now, they have to come through digital channels. And it has to be an experience that is accessible to everybody, from your most technologically savvy to your absolute technological Luddite. I may or may not be picking on certain family members of mine right now. But in addition to that, it has to also be secure. I think most everybody at this point responsible for enrollment has heard a horror story of someone who stood up one of their digital channels too quickly and didn't account for the second factor, and that is we are in a recession. Historically, fraud rates always go up in a recession. So layer on top of that the fact that they now only have to focus on digital channels. And again, something that I've already touched on today already, which is all of our data is already floating around out there to be used. It's their paradise. They can just keep doing this over and over again. And again, particularly picking on those who are new to these digital channels. So it's kind of a do or die moment right now for many industries.
It's not just the identity of individuals, though, is it? Because one of the biggest kind of areas of fraud in the UK is because the government has various stimulus packages to help business through this, and the fraud there is supposedly absolutely rampant. People are making up these fraudulent companies, applying for the support loans and then vanishing. So Adam, I just want to kind of broaden it. So it's not just that we don't have a digital identity infrastructure for people. We don't have a digital identity infrastructure for anything, right? So the fraud isn't just old-fashioned kind of me logging into your bank account and transferring some money out.
Yeah, I think you got people, you've got businesses, and I'm going to add things and devices to that as well. There's interesting work going on in identity of cars and manufacturing. And
right.
How that intersects with people. But I think, you know, one of the interesting things about COVID that I think I've been observing in particular in financial services is the rise or the importance of digital consumer experience as it relates to identity and through different channels. So contactless has become basically the preferred way that people want to do business in person now. What that means is I want to use my Apple Watch to make a payment. I don't want to use a credit card because I can, put my watch somewhere near the reader. I don't have to touch anything. Well, I've recently tried to onboard 2 credit cards into my Apple Pay wallet. I can tell you one bank took me through a nice seamless digital process. The other one, because they did not have a robust digital identity, wanted to call and talk to me. I stopped that process. I just didn't want to deal with it. And now that bank is not in my watch.
I
the missed
how
opportunities.
Representative, we are of the, because I feel like you about this sort of stuff. I had a thing the other day where I was to do with one of my cards, and basically I wanted to do something with it, which required me to fill out a form. And as soon as I saw the thing that said you have to fill out this form, I'm like, I can't be bothered. I'm never going to use that card again. But are we representative, or just like we're tech people, right?
I think we are, and I think increasingly with younger generations, I think that's just the way they prefer, and they were probably already going that way anyway. Now I have older relatives in their 60s and 70s asking me to set up their Apple Watch because they saw me do it and they got one and they don't want to touch things. So I think that's that acceleration that you brought up at the beginning, where some of these technologies that we thought were maybe 5-10 years off are happening now.
And just to go back to that point about business again for a moment, because again, I'm just curious about the US environment around this as well. You're seeing those same kinds of frauds, right? It's people applying for stimulus money they shouldn't have and all this sort of thing. So these are general problems, right?
Yeah, totally. I think totally. I think especially in B2B banking, it's not only this type of fraud that occurs, but regulations and how often they require you to do things like repeat the corporate KYC process and how many times a year, and the extensiveness of the amount of information. How do you actually verify the citizenship and passports of board members of a company that you're trying to do business with? There are certain countries where that's a regulatory requirement. Now you actually compound that in a COVID world. How do I onboard a new business into my bank? That becomes a lot more challenging.
And you're an established and well-known business. I mean, what's it like for startups like Andrew's? It's difficult, right? I can actually give you a practical example because I've had an account with my bank for I don't want to say how many years, and my company has had an account with my bank for I don't want to say how many. The same bank, by the way. And to apply for as part of the COVID stimulus package, I had to register for my bank with, it doesn't matter, but they wanted proof of address, so I sent them a letter from the bank. I sent the bank a letter from the bank to provide proof of address. Like, it's so not joined up. It's so 1970s.
So one of the
and we've had these years where people like us have been saying we need to do something about identity, and nothing's been done about it. And now here, something bad happens, and we're left completely exposed because we have no infrastructure.
Yeah, and
so one of the
you touched on something that I think is interesting, which is paper processes, and I'm sometimes afraid that as identity folks, we always tend to look at things from the negative. So what are the bad things that we're exposed to? But I think one of the other things that's been highlighted in the pandemic is the opportunities. There are some institutions for a long time, but because they were concerned about things like user adoption, et cetera, paused implementing those new identity systems. I think they now have the opportunity to implement those systems so that there could be a whole host of benefits. So, one of the things we talked about was not having to send in a letter from the bank to our bank to prove who we are. There's now an opportunity for us as the consumers to benefit from those new technologies, since we all really have no other choice at the time. Not only that, from the financial institutions perspective, I'm going broader than just banks here. A lot of these new systems will also create a variety of efficiencies, be it just removing paper from processes, but also removing the number of people who have to manually review various steps of the identity process. So I think in addition to wanting keep bad guys out to make sure new business is coming in, I think some financial institutions are also seeing this as an opportunity, as a way to potentially get a leg up on things, regardless of what the future is.
I agree with that, but I want to throw a couple more factors into you guys before we drill down into the kind of main, like a couple of other things I think that have changed recently. Which so you're absolutely right, and the virus has nudged us down that. By the way, did it turn out that wasn't really Megan? It was an imposter who failed the ID test, and now she's been, or is she coming back?
I believe she's being added back when she passes, multiple biometric feature scanning.
Now we've had multiple confirmations from a variety of sources she's coming back. So one factor that's changed is the virus, right? We've dealt with that elephant in the room. I want to throw a couple more things at you just to get your feelings about that I think, just to test out, because I think a couple of other things have changed. So one is what the regulators demand, and one is the kind of nature of fraud in the marketplace. So if we go to the first thing first, in the spring, so basically what I think about digital identity, what in the banks couldn't care less, right? And quite rightly, who am I? I'm just some guy, Actually, what you think about identity, banks don't much care about either, because the people that they care about are the regulators. It's not what we think, it's what the regulators think. And the person that they pay attention to is FATF, Financial Action Task Force. So it seems to me like one big thing that changed was in the spring update to the FATF guidelines. The FATF said, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have it in front of me, but they said something like, in certain circumstances, which i.e. would be using IDEMIA's kit or Experian's databases or, like reputable sources, in certain circumstances, actually digital onboarding is better than physical onboarding. It's not just, it's an alternative that you can use it because there's a virus, or you can use it as a temporary thing while the branches are closed. What they said was it's better. And they weren't talking about remote. They were talking, so this is when you go into the branch, you should be digitally onboarded, just the same as you are kind of remotely. So it seems to me like the regulators have shifted. And has that impacted any of your discussions with your customers?
Yeah, I think it shifted because of progress that we've been making. So, if I can give an example, we're very excited about the work that we're doing with a company called SecureKey and the banks in Canada around digital identity. And it's using technology like blockchain, and I don't think we have to get into those details, but what it's enabling is consumers to digitally and securely share information from various parties to vouch who they are. So just like in the physical world, if I walk into the bank, I might pull out different identity cards. I might bring a deed to my house to show proof of ownership. And it's those things that vouch for me. You brought up earlier, Dave, having to go from one bank to the other. I've already filled out this form and I had this information. Somebody can now securely go up to, I'm opening up a new insurance account in Canada. Well, RBC already does business with me. They know my name and address. TD does. Equifax has this information. Can we securely exchange that? And now the more sources of information that I add, the more points, the harder it is to commit fraud, because those are coming from individually separate sources. You now have to breach and hack a number of different systems to break that. And I think involving regulators in those projects, they're starting to see that, wow, this is not just a way to do this digitally, but it's better than what we do in person.
Better, yeah. That was the point I was edging towards, Megan. So you missed a little bit of the discussion there, Megan. I'm just thinking, what else has changed in the environment? Like, if we'd have been having this panel this time last year, what has changed since then? And one is the virus, obviously. The second, in my opinion, is the regulators, because the new FATF guidelines are much more pro digital onboarding, in fact, not just allowing it, but very pro it. But I think one of the other things that's changed is kind of the nature of the frauds that we're facing, because I see a lot about synthetic fraud, account takeover fraud. So again, just before we start talking about the security and privacy stuff, what do you feel about the nature of the fraud that we're seeing at the moment? Has that changed for you at all?
Yeah, so I'll jump in on this one, because this was actually just something the Fed actually recently gave a report on it, and everyone can go read it. And it was actually the prevalence of synthetic identity fraud. and the various numbers that they have been able to put to it now that they have had adequate time and data in order to analyze it. And it was really scary because, you know, they showed that between 85 to 95% of the time, that specific type of fraud is totally missed. So many times you don't even realize that that's happening. Layer on that the impact that it can have. So in several instances, they were able to find that on average, about 1% of identities in any lending portfolio synthetic, but they could account to up for 20% of the losses in that portfolio. So the fraudsters actually didn't have to be that good at it in order to generate a pretty significant return for themselves. Layer on top of that the fact that they can do this over and over and over and over again. Again, I feel like a broken record, but I keep harping on the fact that all of our data is out there. They have effectively an infinite data source that they can use to keep making these identities over and over if we don't diversify the data that we use in order to identify people.
But why is it so easy for them? I mean, shouldn't it be difficult for me to go and up a bank? I mean, maybe I'm imagining this wrong in the US environment, but if I go to try and open a bank account as a made up person, shouldn't it be more difficult for me? What's going wrong?
I think one of the things that we're not doing that we have the opportunity to do now is actually cryptographically link the data to the person at the transaction time. Anybody that has access to the dark web and a web browser could start to try to create synthetic identities, hack into accounts, do account takeover, all different types of fraud. Because when that data is used, we're not actually tying it back to the person. And I think some of these new identity systems and the ability to say, okay, yes, you've got that data, but am I getting the consent tied to your device? And am I cross-referencing that with information from your telco or other providers to let me know that you're actually in that type of an area? And is building that type of confidence to narrow the attack surface from anybody with a web browser to, you have to physically steal my device.
Yeah, and no, sorry, go ahead, Megan. Go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree with Adam. So many things have changed over time, right? And the beauty about having a digital ID is, one, is that you control the information that you want to share, first of all. And the second thing is, from a government perspective, they can revoke it at any point in time. So that helps a lot. So the current issues that we're seeing a lot in today's environment would be solved with a digital ID. Sorry, Andrew, I'll let you go.
No, absolutely. And I'll actually kind of tee you up pretty nicely with my next comment, because Adam, you brought up an interesting point, which is incorporating data at the point of transaction that is more difficult for the fraudsters to get their hands on. Again, they all know they can get our hands on our social security numbers, our names, our addresses. I feel like probably millions of people at this point know my mother's maiden name and the make and model of my first car. I mean, that data's out there. But incorporating new data, you know, in particular, I'm thinking about biometrics. And I'm not just talking about any biometrics. I'm talking good, solid biometric systems with things like proof of liveness to verify that's a real person transacting with the system at that point in time. I think that's a really interesting opportunity to make it exceptionally difficult for the bad guys. You know, layer on to it, you know, systems like what we're trying to build to, again, preserve privacy, but also make sure that that data doesn't get compromised. I think we have a real unique opportunity to introduce that to consumers, especially as, you know, consumer companies like, you know, Apple and Google have kind of been teeing up biometrics in their minds anyway and making it more familiar to them. Yeah,
but they're using it for, I mean, so biometric authentication, the kind like Face ID and fingerprint ID and stuff like that. That's great. I mean, that's really helpful to us, the fact they put those systems in place. That's not the same thing as the biometric identification, which I have to say verges on the slightly scary, to be honest. And I'm not sure if we really want to go down that route, do we, in the UK or in America?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I guess the question, why, Dave? So we know in India, for example, right, you have the trimodal biometrics. So you have over 1.3 billion people signed up today. You have an Aadhaar number, and then you have your facial or eye and your finger. They can follow up with that to say who you really are. Now, today, there hasn't been any known real breaches on that information that they could steal Megan's identification if she had an Aadhaar number, as well as biometrics. So there is always concern on the biometric piece. You know, there's all these theories like a gummy bear or anything else could do it, but those are not using real government standards, real government issued capabilities, et cetera. Around the world, people are leveraging biometrics. The US is so far behind.
But could that really work in the US? Do people in the US really want the federal government to know, like, every website they log into, every financial transaction they do, there's big cultural differences around the use of biometrics, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll kind of take your side, but with a caveat there, Dave, and that is, I think biometrics.
It's not sides. I'm just curious.
Could be used, but it would have to have, I think, to your point, a pretty significant privacy infrastructure around it. I think that's part of the reason you see things like CCPA implemented in California, modeled after GDPR, which is obviously the gold standard for pretty much all of us right now. Because I think Americans are realizing if we don't put some sort of protection in place, you can get into those really scary situations. But I think we also, from a technological perspective, have to stay ahead of it, so we're not just all trying to build to the regulator standard, but showing the regulators what is possible. And again, that's part of what we've focused on.
Well, that's kind of where I want to start quizzing you guys on the privacy side, actually, because I kind of figure, like, on the security side, we sort of know what to do. Well, actually, I don't, but you guys sort of know what to do, right? I mean, you know how to make secure systems, and we can use those components to build up, these business processes that we need, right? So I think privacy is much tougher, though, because I'm not even sure if we know what we really want on the privacy side. So when Adam says we have to show that, I think that's really right. We do have to find a better way of communing with them, a better way of communicating to the regulators and to law enforcement what the possibilities of the new technology are, because I think some of the things that we take for granted on the cryptographic side, cryptographic blinding, homomorphic proofs, homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs, these kind of things are very hard to explain to people who've lived in a world of filing cabinets and index cards. So I think Adam's got a point, hasn't he? I mean, part of it is down to us to show the regulators that we can have security, and it isn't a balance between security and privacy. If we use the new technology, we can have both of them, right? That's not rose-tinted glasses. You guys can do this, right?
No, we can do it. And I keep going back down to encryption on the device, because it's very similar to how Apple Pay works today. I have to onboard every single device separately if I want to use it on my laptop versus my tablet versus my phone. And that's because they're doing device level encryption. And that's why I don't have to sign a transaction or use chip and pin, because of the confidence they have in that device.
Oh man,
there's all sorts of data,
website,
right?
As soon as I see sign in with Apple, I go straight to that button. Like, I don't want to do it any other way.
Exactly. Now, here's the beauty of systems like that, is that there's so much data that if I lose my phone, that's like the quickest thing I notice. Faster than when people lose their wallet now. They notice if their phone has been stolen. So now the issue is, okay, let's say that somebody got access to my phone. I left it somewhere. We now have the ability to make recoverability like that of a credit card. My credit card is stolen. I drop it. It's compromised. I call the credit card company. They revoke my card. They give me a new one. The criminal can't cause any more damage. Now, my phone's gone. It's been compromised. I've learned that. Today, like, how do you recover from identity theft? It's super hard, and then the fraud bill keeps growing. If I can call whoever's providing me my digital wallet and say, hey, revoke and reissue my key. So the criminal may have a bunch of data about me, but without the key that can be revoked and reissued easily, they can't cause damage with it. And if you can reduce fraud, I think we can reduce it orders of magnitude in these types of systems. And then you start to downplay the need for so much information in biometrics, because the problem's not as big.
I think it illustrates a different way of doing business, though, doesn't it, Megan? I mean, I think certainly on the government side of things, we've come from a world where you get a passport and it lasts 10 years, you know, or you get a driving license. It lasts, actually, I don't know what it lasts, like 10 years or something.
Depends on the state.
It depends on the state. It's funny, actually, my good friend Carey from Authentic posted a great picture on LinkedIn yesterday of a gigantic, like 2.5 hour long line at the DMV just to get a number to be in a queue at the DMV. There was like a 2 hour line just to get a number to be in a queue. The whole thing's mad. But let me just put something in front of you guys, which I think that example illustrates. A digital driving license, right, that's going to deliver security and privacy would work in a very different way to a physical driving license, right? So everybody uses the example of using it in a bar. Okay, so you get your driving license and you show them in a bar. I mean, everybody uses this example because it's a good example, which is like when you show the bar that you're over 21, you're showing them everything about yourself. It's not surprising your identities don't get stolen more often. And it also means that driving licenses get lost in bars and all this sort of thing. So, but a mobile driving license, if a bar says to a mobile driving license, is Dave over 21? Then the only question that license should answer is yes or no, right? It shouldn't say, yeah, here is his height and weight and where he lives and all of these other kind of things. So I think part of the issue we've got is we get the security part of it, but we don't get the privacy part of it because that requires some more complicated thinking. And therefore, we don't really reap the benefits of the transition to digital. So I think the digital vision is security and privacy, right? So what can we do to move forward on this front?
So I think one of the things we always have to do is, there are some instances where you have to improve systems. 100% agree. You know, there are existing infrastructure in place. It has to be there for various critical functions. But you've touched on something interesting, Dave, with your digital driver's license example, which is what happened if we stopped thinking about it as an improvement to our physical IDs? So just translating our physical identities over into the digital, and said, what if we were starting fresh? What if we were building this thing for the first time? What would we want our digital driver's licenses to look like? What functionality would we want them to have? So to your point, what benefit would we as the card holder want to have? What privacy concerns do we need to air out before we make this? What security concerns do we need to air out when we make this? And I think to your point, that just requires a pretty significant paradigm shift. And I think this is where, you know, Adam and Megan and I have to do a lot of thinking and evangelization, which is, I think we often have to dispel a lot of false trade-offs, and again, show technologically how it's possible. So I'm going to try to give a visualization here. So if you imagine, you know, a graph where there's data security on the x-axis, and as you move farther and farther this way, the security increases. But on the other side, you have data usefulness, and as you go higher and higher on that scale, the data becomes increasingly useful. You know, up here at the top, you have plain text data. That's, you know, really not very secure, but it's very useful. And on the other end, all the way on the other side, you have totally anonymized data that no one can do anything with. Everyone to this point has believed there's this kind of like straight line slanting down, and there's just this unavoidable trade-off as we go higher and higher towards privacy. It just has to become less and less useful. I think where we as innovators have to communicate with people is, no, that line actually doesn't have to stay there. And we can show how we're actually bowing that thing out so we can have, to your point, more privacy, more security, as well as more usability.
Really thank you. That's a really good way of thinking about it, Andrew. Thank you. Can I just go back to that driving license thing? Let's test something out on Megan, since she, you know, she has almost all of that market. Just to reflect on something that Andrew said. So the mobile driving license standard, part 5 of the ISO mobile driving license standard, is the interoperability standard. I just want to test a theory with you. So a great part of my young life was wasted messing around on something called X400. None of you are old enough to remember this, but X400 was electronic mail that was going to be run by the telecoms operators. and it has vanished without trace. Even archaeologists wouldn't be able to uncover a trace of X400. It's going to die with old people like me. But with it, because you had this electronic mail, you needed a directory, and there was a directory standard called X500 that went with it. And all of that's been completely forgotten as well. That's all disappeared, except for X509, which was the standard for the public key certificates. And that lived on into, you know, SSL and life beyond. So the messaging all went away, but the standard, and I'm just wondering, like, the mobile driving license interoperability standard, am I crazy, or could that be the standard we actually need to start exchanging identities?
I believe it is the standard that we need to exchange.
Okay, and just to be very clear, I've never met you before in my life. I didn't send you that question. Just please tell the audience that this wasn't prearranged, right?
I was not prearranged. I didn't meet Dave Birch before. It's the first time I've been on one of his panels, so I'm super excited to be here. And I was gone for a minute because I was creating digital IDs for the rest of you. So, so proof like that.
Idea, right?
But at the end of the day, you know, there's huge opportunities. I know Dave just talked about a little bit about just saying, all right, here is how old I am. I'm over 18 or over 21. No one needs to know my weight. No one needs to know what address I am, et cetera. But at the same time, it also allows me to share information and what information I want to share with people, because not everybody needs to know that digitally or as well as physically as well. So you think about it, you know, if you're going to use an example with like the EID in Estonia, right? They have access to over 5,000 different opportunities with it. You don't need, you know, when you go to the library, if I use an EID to do an Audible from it, right? I want to listen to download or get a Kindle book. They don't need to know all the information. They just need to know that I do have access to that physical library, for example, as well. And that Megan is really who she is. On the digital piece too, at the banks and everything else, God, I think it would be fabulous. Couldn't wait till that actually happens here in North America.
So
what's the holdup? I mean, you know, Estonia is an interesting, and actually Estonia is a real place, by the way. I've actually been there.
Yeah, it has over 1 million people.
Yeah,
and it's beautiful. Tallinn is beautiful.
It's about the size of Matt.
I've had one of the best pretzels of my life in Tallinn.
You know, I don't know if we can use that as an example for the US, because it depends on very centralized authority that the US doesn't have. In the US, thinking about how to deliver privacy through interoperability, you know, might be more fruitful, because we have so many different bodies and organizations and layers in.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's why I think all of us are working with not only the governments, but private industry as well, right? So many, like banks, from, you know, Experian to IBM to et cetera, everybody is working on this interoperability and ability to move forward. So it has to be a mixture here, especially in the United States, between mixture of private as well as public in order for this to work. So,
yeah, but I think one of the opportunities that we're trying to push towards is we have to be careful. We have identity standards, and then we have standards around exchanging financial data. And if those diverge too much, like actually making this work so it's not Frankenstein under the covers and you can deliver a good consumer experience so it's adopted, is going to be hard. So, you know, that's where I think participating for us, it's not just groups like the Decentralized Identity Foundation and others driving those standards, but it's Financial Data Exchange, FDX, and some of those other groups as well, and making sure that those standards actually like make sense together.
Okay, we've got to start wrapping up now, guys. But I just want to, if I can just sort of put 3 key points in front of people to take away, like what I heard you said. I mean, in a way, what I heard you say was actually security. You guys know how to do that, so we should be comfortable about the levels of security. I think technology can contribute more to privacy if we, and I'm not blaming other people for this, if we get better at communicating the potential of that new technology to the regulators and to the lawmakers, which means optimistically we can have security and privacy. It isn't a trade-off. And then, and finally, this point about interop in the US environment, it's something to do, like I'm not smart enough to know what the path through that is, but I can see that this interoperability is something to do with breaking the logjam in the US, right? Is that a fair observation around that too? Okay, thank you very much. Well, listen, guys, it was so great of you to give up your time to join us here today. I'm sure that the people looking in really valued hearing your opinion. You didn't know what I was going to ask you. I really appreciate people giving us their expertise and their personal opinions about things. So thank you very much for that, and look forward to talking again soon. And with that, I will say back to the studio, or whatever it is you say in these circumstances.
Thank you.
Back to the living room.